A human body smells like pork when it burns. The crowds that gathered outside Smithfield Market knew this well. They didn't whisper it, but the stench hung over them, heavy, oily, unforgettable. The church bells clanged like teeth grinding bone. Somewhere in the smoke, a woman screamed not from pain, but from awe. Heretics, they said. But to the fire, it made no difference. All flesh sings the same song when it dies. For Mary Tudor, Queen of England, daughter of the great Henry, that song was her symphony. History would call her Bloody Mary. But in the mirror of her own mind, she was God's avenger, the true heir, the sacred flame. She stood wrapped in velvet, its crimson folds licking her ankles like fire reborn. She smelled of rose oil and dried blood. Her eyes, once soft, were now carved from glass. The world remembered her as a monster. But monsters are made, not born. As a child, Mary had been praised as the Pearl of England, clever, pious, fluent in Latin, before most girls could sew. Her father kissed her forehead before court. Her mother, Queen Catherine, whispered Castilian lullabies as her fingers braided her hair. The court adored her. Until it didn't. Until Anne Boleyn. Until Henry's hunger reshaped England with ink and fire. The girl who had once been a princess found herself illegitimate. Stripped of title, stripped of status, forbidden even to speak her mother's name. The air around her changed, doors no longer opened. Servants no longer bowed. She was not removed, but erased. But some things refuse erasure. She knelt beside her mother's corpse, untouched in its Spanish coffin. No fanfare, no procession. Just rot and quiet. Her mother had died, calling herself queen. Mary swore the same vow, I will not disappear. When Henry died, and the boy King Edward came and went like a cold breath in winter, Mary waited. And when Jane Grey was thrust forward, a puppet in silk, Mary did not run. She rode. Through fog and thunder, surrounded by a cavalcade of peasants and priests, she rode toward London. Her cheeks flushed red in the wind, her eyes dry as bone. The people cheered as if Christ himself had returned. And perhaps in some twisted way, he had. If you crave chilling, untold corners of history, like this video, and subscribe for more. She stood on the palace balcony, the crown finally in her hands. Not the golden bauble, but the weight of it. A nation's rot pulsing beneath her feet. Her fingers dug into its filigree like claws. The kingdom was hers now, but not as the girl they had once adored, not as the daughter, not even as the woman. She would reign as flame. She gave orders with a tongue that once stuttered. She signed warrants with a hand once too small to hold a quill. The court watched in silence as the girl ghost became sovereign. Parliament flinched, bishops trembled, even the wind seemed to pull back when she passed. Mary's first decree was mercy. She wrote it in ink that smelled faintly of ash. She promised no vengeance. She promised peace. But peace requires forgetting. And Mary remembered everything. The council begged her to marry, to produce an heir, to protect the Tudor bloodline from Protestant corruption. She nodded. Yes, of course. But her heart beat with different prayers. She dreamed of her mother's hollow eyes, of Anne Boleyn's severed head blinking in its final seconds, of her father's corpulent corpse bursting open in its coffin dogs, licking at the juices. She dreamed of fire. The fires began slowly. A few trials, a few executions. Heretics, they said. Men who spat on the host. Women who taught their children that Christ was a symbol, not a sacrifice. The flames cleansed them. She did not watch. Not at first. But the smells reached her chambers. Even with rose oil, even with incense, the smoke whispered through cracks in the stone. It clung to her hair, her skin, her dreams. Sometimes she woke, choking, not from fear, but from ecstasy. Because power, she realized, is not held in crowns. It's held in breath, And when that breath is taken by rope, by sword, by fire, it becomes eternal. London learned to fear the dawn. The red sky was no longer a shepherd's warning, but a queen's decree. The smoke of martyrs curled around church steeples. Children sang hymns with ash on their lips. And Mary, she stood in her chapel, whispering Latin so softly, it sounded like weeping. The same priests who had once denied her now kissed her ring. The same nobles who mocked her mother now offered trembling gifts. But none of them saw the truth. Her crown was heavy, not with gold, but with ghosts. And in the silence of her bedchamber, when no one watched, she wept not for what she had done, but for what she had become. The girl was gone. The woman had burned. All that remained was the queen. The palace corridors grew quieter in winter, not from snow London rarely dressed in white, but from dread. It was as if the stone itself held its breath. Somewhere deep in the royal chambers, Mary pressed her hand to her belly and told herself it moved. She was certain this time. The nausea, the swelling, the aching bones. The servants trained to smile, without question, whispered behind tapestries. The queen is with child. Bells rang across the city in premature celebration. Bonfires were prepared, lullabies practiced. She would give England a Catholic air. She would erase Elizabeth with blood. But weeks passed, then months. No quickening came, no flutter, no kick, only pressure building, shifting, mocking. She ordered the cradle carved in Spanish cedar, a nursemaid appointed, tiny linen robes sewn by trembling hands, but the crib remained empty, like her womb. The silence screamed louder than a cathedral full of prayers. Her confessor, the ever-watchful Bishop Gardiner, assured her it was the will of God. "Delay is not denial," he whispered. But Mary knew better. She had lived her entire life on delay. What grows in a body that holds nothing? Not life. Only mold. The kind that creeps between the ribs of forgotten tombs, slick and stubborn, and Mary, despite her crown, was still a daughter of loss. Still the girl who held her mother's cold hand as they removed her titles. The midwives pretended. Their faces said nothing, but their eyes did. And when the pain began, not labor, but something deeper, darker, Mary refused to scream. Queens do not scream, not even when their own blood turns against them. The physician placed a hand gently on her abdomen. "There is no child," he murmured. She didn't answer. The room emptied. Only her lady-in-waiting Jane Dormer lingered, her fingers twitching as if to comfort her mistress. But Mary waved her away, with eyes as hollow as the cradle. She did not cry. Tears are a kind of mercy, and Mary no longer trafficked in mercy. Later that night she summoned a mirror. The image that greeted her was not pregnant, nor young. It was pale-lined and drawn. The corners of her mouth had fallen into permanent grief. Her hair, once brushed until it gleamed, now curled in wilting strands, heavy with oil. She asked the mirror a question. "Is this the face of a queen?" It did not answer. Mirrors never do, but sometimes they reveal the truth more cruelly than words. Whispers spread like disease. Courtiers learned not to meet her gaze. Even the servants stopped humming lullabies in the corridors. The cradle was removed quietly in the night. But the ghost of the child remained. It moved in her thoughts, if not her womb. It cried behind doors. It tugged at her heart in the chapel. She began to dream of small hands reaching for her, only to turn to ash when touched. She dreamed of Elizabeth, her half-sister, laughing in the gardens, unbothered, unburdened. That Protestant serpent with golden hair and eyes too sharp to be innocent. Mary prayed harder, hard enough to split her lips. She fasted, wore coarse linen under her robes, beat her chest until it bruised. But God remained silent. And so did her body. When her monthly bleeding returned, it felt like betrayal. Red on white, just as when she had been declared illegitimate all those years ago. Again and again, the cycle repeated. The swell of hope, the whisper of a child, the parade of physicians, the crushing silence. Each false pregnancy carved a new hollowness inside her, like a cathedral built only to echo. Outside the palace, the fires still burned. Heretics screamed. Smoke danced above rooftops. But inside, within the flesh and soul of England's queen, was only absence. Philip, her Spanish husband, grew cold, not in cruelty, but in distance. His duty was complete, the alliance made. His letters arrived less and less, and when he did return, his eyes skimmed over her like the surface of a dying lake. Still she smiled. Still she knelt beside his boots and thanked God for the union. But at night, when even the guards outside her door dared not speak, Mary pressed her fingers to the underside of her ribs, feeling for movement that never came. And in that silence, something twisted. Not grief. Grief had a name, a shape. This was deeper. This was rot. The physicians now whispered other things: dropsy, tumor, wasting illness. Perhaps the body had grown tired of false hope and chosen truth instead. She refused examination. She refused all talk of death. She was a queen, a vessel of divine right. She could not die, not without fulfilling the will of God. Yet her hands trembled. Her breath shortened. Her sleep became shallow. One night, as the fire in her hearth died down to black embers, Mary awoke to the sound of crying. It was not a servant, not a baby. It was her. Choked, stifled, buried in layers of velvet, and regret the sobs clawed out of her like ghosts demanding names. She wept until dawn, then rose and dressed as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Even the womb that had once promised legacy now whispered only endings. Every palace has its night creatures. They skulk along cornices and creep beneath tapestries, feeding on discarded secrets the way rats chew candle stubs. But at Whitehall, the creatures had learned new tricks. They bowed. They curtsied. They addressed one another as Your Grace. In daylight, they looked like courtiers. After dusk, they melted into silhouettes that clung to the walls and listened. Mary felt them long before she saw them. A sudden hush when she rounded a corner. A quill that stopped scratching the moment her slipper brushed the rushes. The way conversations shifted, as if she herself were the ghost haunting the corridors. She carried her hollowness like a reliquary, and the emptiness made space for whispers to nest. At council meetings, polished oak reflected rows of compliant faces, but their smiles, browned like fruit, left too long in the sun. The Duke of Norfolk bowed lower than piety required. The Earl of Pembroke pressed his lips so tightly they blanched. Gardiner's blessing hands now trembled on every benediction, as though afraid the sign of the cross might burn him instead. Only Elizabeth's absence spoke plainly. She had retreated to Hatfield, pleading health. Yet every rider from the shires arrived with fresher rumors of the girl's Protestant sympathies, her silver-tongued charisma, her laughing eyes that promised England another future. Parliament reconvened under chandeliers that dripped molten wax, like fat from the heretics' pyres. There, Mary's proclamations once echoed by cheers met polite applause. The polite applause met polite excuses, until politeness itself became a blade honed by repetition. Her ears rang with it, polite, 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 as if the word alone could sand down her edges and render her harmless. She tested the edges instead. Spies were dispatched like seeds in wind to Hatfield, to the French embassy, to the merchant guilds, where coffee-dark plots brewed beside trade ledgers. Reports filtered back thick rolls of parchment, reeking of tallow and fear. Some were empty, others fevered, but enough were true to confirm her suspicion. Treason is not written in ink. It lodges in the throat a swallowed oath that festers until it erupts. The palace guards changed formation. Halberds stood taller, pikes gleamed sharper. Doors once left ajar, now thudded shut, sealed with iron bolts. Even Philip's apartments, vacant since his latest departure to Spain, were patrolled like a frontier. Yet safety never arrived. The more walls she raised, the longer the corridors seemed stretching beyond measurable geometry into a maze first imagined in her grief. Nights grew longer. Candles guttered in drafts that had no earthly source. Mary woke to footfalls in antechambers, to muffled coughs behind arras cloth. Once a figure materialized at the far end of her privy gallery, tall, slender, wearing a hooded mantle, the color of milk gone sour. Her breath snagged Elizabeth no. The figure wavered, dissolved into moonlight, leaving only the echo of silk brushing stone. Hallucination, or enemy. In the new arithmetic of her mind, they equaled the same. She ordered every mirror shrouded. Glass was treacherous. It could show her face, yes, but might also show one standing behind her. Better darkness than the doubly haunted light. And still the council urged leniency. "Your Majesty, the realm tires of executions," Norfolk ventured, voice brittle as frost. "Mercy breeds loyalty." Mary's gaze slid over him like a drawn sword. "Mercy bred rebellion," she answered, recalling Jane Grey's soft neck bent beneath an axe. "Loyalty is purchased in coin the color of blood." Afterward she sat alone beneath the cloth of state. The throne seemed to pulse, warm as flesh, cold as bone. In its carved lions she saw her father's swollen corpse bursting in St. George's Chapel. In its gilded roses she smelled the phantom cradle hauled away at midnight. Power, she realized, was devouring her from within, not poison in a chalice, but termites in the wood of faith. She dined sparingly, appetite lost to the metallic taste of anxiety. Wine soured on her tongue. Bread crumbled to ash. Even the perfumed sleeves she once favored now felt like bindings, tightening each time she signed another warrant. News arrived. Elizabeth's servants smuggled English Bibles into her chapel. Foreign envoys toasted the princess as the inevitable sunrise after Mary's long night. In response, Mary's pen split parchment blotting crimson across vellum. Elizabeth was summoned to court, questioned, released, summoned again. Each time the girl returned with smiles, unfractured politeness, weaponized by youth. One storm-black evening, lightning knotted the sky over the Thames. In the council chamber's wavering gloom, Mary confronted her sister. Rain hammered leaded glass, a drumline, urging violence. Elizabeth curtsied skirts, ghosting over rush-covered boards. "Have you prayed for my death?" Mary asked. A pause, thin as silk thread. "I pray for your Majesty's health," Elizabeth replied. The answer floated, perfumed with obedience, hollow at its core. The chamber smelled suddenly of smithy smoke, and Mary remembered Smithfield the First, fires the singing flesh. She tasted char on the back of her throat, and saw in Elizabeth's unblinking eyes the reflection of every stake yet unlit. That night, sleep would not claim her. Shadows jittered across the tester of her bed. Beyond the drapes she sensed movements too rhythmic for tapestry. Folds, a servant pacing, a murderer counting steps. Uncertainty stiffened her limbs until dawn, bled gray into the room. Physicians blamed melancholic vapors. They recommended bleeding-sugared lozenges, pilgrimages. She laughed, dry brittle, because what pilgrimage exceeds the fires she had already walked through? The leech bowl overflowed, but paranoia thickened instead of thinning. By summer she trusted no one. Letters from Philip remained unopened. She feared invisible inks. Wine-bearers were ordered to drink first. 2 collapsed from nerves alone. When ambassadors bowed, she studied the carpet between them for traps. The crimson velvet of her gown seemed to whisper warnings. They are coming. They are coming. Whitehall shifted to match her dread. Torches burned longer tapestries, darkened with damp clove-spiked oranges, hung in corridors to mask the odor of fear. Guards heard laughter where no mouths moved. A boy cleaning the privy staircase swore he saw a severed head blink before rolling away. He screamed until dismissed for madness, and somewhere in those labyrinthine halls, the cradle, that cruel relic, reappeared unbidden. It stood beneath a candelabrum, rocking gently, though no child lay within. Servants crossed themselves and fled, but Mary approached. Her fingers brushed the cedar railing. It was warm, too warm, as though an unseen infant breathed there. For a heartbeat, she felt milk rise in breasts long barren. Then the warmth recoiled, the cradle stilled, and she understood. The palace itself had become her womb of smoke, every corridor an umbilical coil feeding dread back into her heart. The child she never bore had matured into spectre, and it marched beside treason. In that understanding, a decision sharpened. If England would not love her, it would at least fear her perfectly. She would cauterize every whisper, sever every smiling mask from the bone beneath. Paranoia at last granted clarity. The throne room filled with shadows, but only one shadow could cast the final shade. Fire, true fire, has no memory. It devours, forgets, moves on. But the flames Mary Tudor ordained across England grew fat on remembrance. Each new pyre licked at the echoes of the last, carrying the scent of carbonized faith from shire to shire. It was as though the kingdom itself became a single, long, exhaling furnace, and the queen its bellows. The first great sweep came with February's knife-edge cold. Ice rhymed the Thames, and cathedral bells cracked the morning with brittle peals. In the gray pre-dawn wagon after wagon creaked into Smithfield, groaning beneath cages of men and women, condemned not by sword, but by syllable heresy. Their crimes were verses in English prayers, whispered without Latin bread, broken without genuflection. Against the vast machinery of monarchy, such trespasses looked small, almost pitiable. Yet small sparks set ships ablaze. Mary watched from a curtained gallery. She had sworn once never to witness such spectacles, yet here she stood as though a phantom hand had drawn the drapes apart for her. Below the scaffold rose like a throne of thorns, tar-coated stakes ringed by bundles of furs. The prisoners' chains chimed a dreary litany, while friars mumbled last rites too softly for heaven to hear. When torches were thrust into kindling, light shot upward, fierce as an uncaged hawk. A gust caught the flames, and they bent east as if pointing toward Hatfield, toward Elizabeth. Heat struck her cheeks. In the moment before the screaming began, Mary felt something unclench inside her, a hush like the space between heartbeat and echo. She imagined her late mother standing beside her approving, and for an instant the crown rested easily. Then sound shattered the silence, skin, blistering lungs, shriveling voices cracking into syllables that no prayer could mend. The crowd's roar swelled to drown the victims' cries. Some watchers sobbed, others cheered. Mary's pulse did neither. It simply marked time as steady as a metronome keeping rhythm for divine judgment. That night she tried to pray, but the taste of smoke coated every word. She rose, lips cracked, and poured wine that stank faintly of pitch. Across the chamber the cedar cradle loomed, returned impossible to remove. Its rockers creaked, though no breeze stirred. She set her goblet on the windowsill and pressed forehead to cold glass. Below the last embers at Smithfield glimmered like nursery coals. She felt milk that would never flow Titan phantom heavy in her breasts, and with clenched teeth whispered, "Hush, baby. The fire sings for you." The pyres multiplied. Oxford, Gloucester, Canterbury. Each city received Mary's envoys, sheriffs armed with writs, bishops with inquisitorial questions sharp as skewers. Where courts hesitated, soldiers elbowed doubt aside. They marched prisoners through streets already red with Tudor banners, and by nightfall woodpiles sprouted like malignant blooms. Parliament murmured. Foreign ambassadors shifted uncomfortably behind polite smiles. Even Gardner, once a furnace fan himself, advised temperance. Mary listened, eyes hooded, then quoted scripture until the chamber chilled. "I am come to send fire on the earth, and what will I, if it be already kindled?" The council fell silent, the verse hanging like soot in stagnant air. Inside Mary, something else ignited a conversion of grief to purpose. The hollow womb, The haunted corridors, the mirrors veiled in black, all of it now fed the blaze. She wore darker gowns, rich as dried blood, their stiff brocade scratching her wrists like penitent hair shirts. On state processions, she inhaled chimney smoke as though it were frankincense. Crowds knelt. Some crossed themselves in fear rather than reverence. She accepted both. Fear was simply reverence with the mask torn away, yet fire consumes fuel, and England's flesh was finite. Reports reached her of villages emptied by refugees of charred farmlands, where wind scattered the ashes of believers and unbelievers alike. Traders spoke of markets hushed, of sermons delivered underground, of mothers teaching children to mouth prayers silently, so as not to rouse the night's ears. Mary read these scrolls by candlelight, the flames' jitter echoing her quickened heartbeat. She should have felt triumph. Instead, fatigue seeped through her bones, like damp. Sleep retreated further. Some midnights she prowled unseen halls, torch in hand, convinced the tapestry eyes tracked her steps. Other nights she halted before Philip's locked apartments, fingers hovering over the latch, wanting the impossible comfort of a husband, long gone. Behind that door, she pictured not a prince, but piles of darkened cinders, as though even absence had burned. London's river mirrored the sky's sickly glow. Bargemen told tales of night vapors that rose steam-thin off the water, coalescing into forms that resembled burned martyrs, whispering judgment on the living. Superstition, the council insisted. But Mary knew ghosts. She wore them like jewels. Then came the day a child, rosy-faced, apple-cheeked, shouted Bloody Mary as her litter passed. The nursemaid clamped a hand over the boy's mouth too late. The name sliced the air and lodged in the Queen's ear like a splinter of glass. Mary ordered no punishment. Instead, she stared at the boy, studied the quicksilver terror in his eyes, and saw reflected the wide, unblinking gaze of every soul she had consigned to smoke. For a heartbeat, the pyres flickered in doubt. That night, she dreamed of the cedar cradle ablaze, rocking while flames licked its rails. From within rose neither scream nor cry, only the steady hum of burning wood. She woke gagging on heat, clawing at bedclothes now damp with sweat that smelled of pitch. Morning found her paler lips bluish, but her voice when she addressed the council cracked like kindling. "The realm is sick," she said, "and sickness demands cautery." Even Norfolk Grey as winter moss looked away. The council sealed fresh warrants. Henry's old sword said to sing in the air was removed from the royal armory and carried to executions as token of Tudor justice. Its blade, long untended, bore rust like spreading rot, yet when raised it gleamed, reflecting the pyre's light. Mary thought of her father's bloated corpse bursting. She wondered whether steel too could bloat on sins. As weeks bled into months, London's sky-browned sunsets drowning in their own smoke. Respiratory ailments spiked. Midwives recorded newborns coughing black specks. The physician muttered of miasmas. Mary listened, imagining England itself a great infant, choking on afterbirth. She should stop, she knew, lest the kingdom die before it could repent. And yet how else to scorch doubt from marrow? One twilight, leaning over the palace parapet, she realized the fires below spelled her initials in wavering red. M.R. Maria Regina, formed then deformed with shifting wind. For the first time, fear pinched her throat. What if the flames no longer obeyed? Somewhere behind her, that cradle creaked again. Remember that final prayer, a voice asked her mother's Elizabeth's, her own unborn child's. She could not tell. Turning, she saw only a corridor choking on shadows. Mary pressed fingers to her temples. The fires she had lit were now lit within her arteries, felt singed breath, rasped like bellows. Softness, tenderness. Any filament of love left in her soul crackled, curled, turned black. On the parapet ledge, a fleck of ash landed, cooled, and broke apart a tiny charred flake, indistinguishable from any relic of those who had burned for her creed. Wind lifted it again. It vanished into the gloaming. For an instant she imagined herself scattering likewise one cinder among thousands untraceable, unnamed. But queens do not vanish. They burn until the kingdom itself is smoke. They began in the corners, first as murmurs just barely sound like parchment brushing itself to life in the dark. Then sighs too human to dismiss as wind. Mary would stir in her chair, thinking the fire behind her had shifted, but find no movement. The pages she wasn't reading would rustle on their own. Candles would tremble without a breeze, and always, always her skin would chill. One midnight, a mirror long veiled forgotten, cracked from end to end, without cause. The sound woke her with a scream, her own throat-raw heart lurching like a spooked mare. The chambermaid who found her sitting upright in bed, eyes glazed, claimed the queen, whispered in Spanish to someone who wasn't there. It grew worse. The nights bled together. Sleep became an ambush rather than a refuge. When it came with voices, mothers howling, infants sobbing, the crackle of wet wood in flames. In her dreams, she walked the scaffold in slippered feet, looked down, and saw her own hands bound in silk cords, her skin flaking as smoke curled from her fingernails. Faces she had never seen called her name. Not Majesty, not Mary, but something older, bruja, whore, mother. She began to smell things that weren't present. Wet soot, burned milk, the vinegar sting of cauterized wounds. The cradle in the corner rocked when she turned her back. A maid fainted one morning after lifting the blanket inside and finding it filled with charred feathers. Her physicians tried leeches, then tonics, then prayers. But the queen's condition defied explanation. The soul is diseased, one muttered when he thought he was out of earshot. He was never seen at court again. Gardner came at dawn, summoned to her bedside in haste. She clutched his wrist with alarming strength and asked, "Can the devil take the form of the dead?" He paled. "Only if God permits it." She did not release his arm for a long time. Elizabeth's name came to her in waking visions, not spoken, written, scratched onto the condensation of her window pane by an invisible fingertip, etched into the wax of her seal, cut into the leather of a book she had never ordered. Sometimes Mary thought she saw her half-sister's shadow stepping out of the mirror, mocking her with youth and silence. Philip's face, long absent, returned not in letters, but in hallucinations. Once she awoke, convinced he had entered her chamber, and kissed her hand. The servant swore no one had come or gone. She insisted his ring had been pressed into her palm. There was no mark. The dead did not knock. They seeped. The court whispered, of course. It always did. But now the whispers moved differently, less with intrigue than fear. A rumor passed that Mary no longer walked, but floated, that her eyes no longer blinked in sequence with speech. Another courtier swore he saw a scorch mark form beneath her bare foot as she prayed before the chapel altar. She gave fewer audiences. Letters piled unopened on her writing desk, parchment curling at the corners. A spider built a nest in her inkwell. She didn't stop it. The only human contact she allowed freely was with a boy chorister no older than 10 who sang Latin hymns at her door each night. His voice, unbroken, reed-thin, was the only sound that didn't echo inside her skull. Once he stopped mid-verse. When asked why, he said, "There were others singing too, but I couldn't see them." He was dismissed the next morning. Still the ghosts came. Jane Grey, that tender child queen, executed before she had even learned to lie. Mary saw her sometimes standing in corners, eyes wide, holding her own severed head in her arms, like a baby. When she blinked, the head whispered, "You crowned yourself with my death." Anne Boleyn, laughing, always laughing, draped in green satin, pointing at Mary's empty belly and laughing until her mouth bled. Even Catherine of Aragon, her own mother, appeared, not in mercy, but as a revenant robed in funeral black lips, sewn shut with threads of Spanish gold. When Mary reached to embrace her, Catherine turned her back and wept red tears that left streaks down her shoulders. "My daughter, my ghost," she seemed to say. "You have become the thing they named you." The queen began sleeping in the day, when shadows were smallest. But even then, the warmth didn't save her. A blackbird dead charred appeared on her pillow, once its beak open in silent scream. She did not flinch. Outside the city's fires dimmed. The burnings were slowing not from conscience, but exhaustion. There were fewer to burn. The woodpiles were damp with spring rain, and crowds no longer gathered like they used to. A man burned alone in York, attended by a single sheriff and 2 dogs who snarled at the flames. Inside, Mary's soul hollowed. She stopped eating. Bread turned to grit in her mouth, water to bile. Her body shrank beneath its robes. Her bones poked forward like relics pressing against shroud cloth. Elizabeth always, Elizabeth. The name surfaced like oil on everything. Her face glowed in the firelight of Mary's fevers. Courtiers' eyes brightened at her mention. "God preserve the princess," one said quietly, but not quietly enough. That man's tongue was removed. In the final weeks of summer, Mary spoke less and less. When she did, it was not in English or Spanish, but something older forgotten, perhaps the speech of dying queens, a language only ghosts could understand. Her chamberlain recorded her murmuring one night, "They walk at midnight, and I walk with them." The next morning, he fled court. On the feast of St. Bartholomew, Mary ordered her chapel lined with candles, one for every soul she had sent to judgment. There were over 280. When the last wick was lit, the heat was unbearable. Paint peeled from the walls. The scent of wax and smoke thickened until it was hard to tell where prayer ended and burning began. She stood at the altar and whispered each name she could recall. She didn't expect forgiveness, only recognition. That night, no one approached her chamber, but a guard posted near her door claimed he heard dozens of voices speaking in unison. He resigned the next day and joined a monastery. The cradle remained, rocking, always empty, sometimes filled with bones in dreams, other times with a crown made entirely of teeth. Mary no longer feared it. She was the ghost now. The chill came slowly, at first disguised as fatigue, then clothed itself in sweat. By late October, Mary Tudor could no longer stand without assistance. Her joints ached as if they had been burned from the inside. When she breathed, there was a rattle. Not quite a cough, not quite a groan, just enough to make listeners wince. The physicians called it a humor imbalance. But behind closed doors, they said it outright: the Queen was dying. She did not disagree, only corrected them: "I am not dying, I am being unmade." Even her sleep had abandoned her. In its place came the gloved hand of fever, gentle, cruel, intimate. She hallucinated lace where there was shadow bells, where there was silence, and worst of all, warm breath against her neck when no one was near. The body was failing, yes, but it was her soul that had grown septic. The court smelled it before they admitted it. They moved about her chambers with handkerchiefs steeped in rosewater and vinegar. The air grew thick with the perfume of panic. They still called her Majesty, but the curtsy came quicker. The eyes darted sideways. One morning, her favorite handmaid brought broth only to spill it from shaking hands. The bowl shattered. The Queen did not flinch. "Leave it," she whispered, voice coarse as unstrung wool. "Everything's breaking now." Gardner was gone dead the year before. The men who replaced him came from Spain, speaking of shrines and relics of cleansing through holy suffering. One brought a saint's knuckle in a gold case and touched it to Mary's brow. She burned for days afterward as if the bone had cursed her. Philip did not return. His final letter, brief, bloodless, wished her strength and reminded her of eternal rewards. He had taken another wife. It was political, of course. All marriages were. Mary read the letter once, then held it to a candle until the words blackened and curled into ash. "The fire sings for you, too," she murmured, watching it disappear. It was in her belly now, the sickness. Not a child. Never a child. But something else. Swollen tight, hissing beneath her skin. Some nights she pressed her hands to it, imagining it was her guilt incubated into form. Other times she imagined it was England itself devouring its queen from within. The council came less frequently. No one wished to speak of succession in the dying woman's presence. But the whispers had changed tone. They no longer feared her, they anticipated her absence. Elizabeth's name passed between lips like communion wafers. Sacred, dangerous. Swallowed quickly. She heard it. She heard everything. So she summoned her half-sister. Elizabeth came reluctantly riding through November fog in gold-trimmed black. She looked every inch the future. Her hair was unbound, her eyes sharpened by restraint. She walked with a careful smile, the kind that does not reach the throat. When she entered the Queen's chamber, she did not flinch at the smell. She bowed low. "Your Majesty," she said. Mary lay in a bed too large for her now, her limbs like pale roots beneath a tangle of velvet and linen. Her face, once so stern, had collapsed inwards, but the eyes, they still burned, dull embers clinging to heat. She gestured weakly. Elizabeth came closer. "You wear black already," Mary rasped. "I mourn the season," Elizabeth replied, gaze unwavering. Mary stared at her for a long time. The fire snapped in the grate. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, something scurried. "You were always a better liar than your mother." Elizabeth did not deny it. Mary gestured to the stool beside the bed. Elizabeth sat. "Do you pray for me?" the Queen asked. "I pray for England," Elizabeth answered. Mary's smile was thin and savage. "Then you pray for yourself." Silence grew between them. The cradle sat in its shadowed corner, unmoving. The fireplace hissed. At length Mary spoke again. "They say I lit the kingdom, that I bathed it in blood." Elizabeth tilted her head slightly. "They are not wrong," Mary admitted. "But they forget I was crowned in ashes." For the first time, something flickered in Elizabeth's gaze. Pity, numbra recognition. Mary turned her face toward the window where the light bled pale through gray sky. The fire was the only thing that would listen to me. The only thing that took what I gave it and answered back. Elizabeth said nothing. "But it takes everything," Mary continued. "Even your name, even your womb. It leaves only shadow." From the hallway, a crash, something dropped, someone fleeing. The Queen's physician, perhaps startled by another screamless hallucination. Mary didn't react. Her voice was fading, breath slicing each word. "I dream of them," she said. "I see them dancing. The ones I burned. They hold hands. They make rings around my bed." Elizabeth, now pale herself, whispered, "And what do they say?" Mary's mouth twisted. "They sing. That same hymn. The one I forbade." Elizabeth stood. "You asked me here for a reason. Say it." The Queen of England turned her face to the ceiling. Her eyes blinked once, twice. "Do not marry Philip," she said. "Do not mistake devotion for control." Elizabeth waited. "And do not think the crown will keep you warm." That was all. She gestured for the girl to leave. Elizabeth bowed again, low, deeper this time, as if lowering herself before a tomb. She never returned. That night Mary bled again. Thick, clotted black. The sheets reeked of iron and rot. She did not call for help. The cradle moved. No one had touched it. The rockers groaned like a warning. And from the hearth, a coal snapped, exploded like a voice. The Queen coughed once, blood spraying her sleeve. She wiped it with the back of her hand and whispered, "I know. I know." She was not alone. Death had not come from outside. It had always been beside her, at her bedside, in her bones, in the very crown she once believed divine. By December, the crown had grown too heavy. Not in weight, it had always pressed hard against her temples, left faint bruises where the gold bit skin, but in meaning. It no longer symbolized rule or right. It had become an open wound, something worn not to command, but to bleed from. Mary Tudor no longer left her chambers. The corridors beyond her doors echoed without her filled, instead by the dry rustle of advisers in hushed debate. Once the Queen's every footstep summoned order. Now her absence summoned opportunity. Her body deteriorated quickly. The swell in her abdomen no longer pretended to be pregnancy. It throbbed with the slow, wet heat of infection. Her face sank sharp as a blade's profile, and her lips chapped until they split into red-lined smiles she could not control. Her ladies whispered, but dared not flee. Those who had remained did so out of loyalty or inertia. They lit the candles, brought the bowls, perfumed the pillows. But they did not meet her gaze. Something behind her eyes unnerved them. Perhaps it was the clarity of someone standing at death's edge, no longer pretending the living world matters. The crown sat upon a cushion nearby a polished Ouroboros of ambition and suffering. Mary stared at it often, not with reverence, but curiosity, like one might regard a weapon left beside a battlefield. She remembered the first time it touched her brow, how the archbishop's fingers trembled as he pressed it down, how the people cheered, how the sky darkened by noon. Now even birds avoided the tower spires. She tried once to lift it to remind herself it was real. Her fingers, thin as claws, slipped against the filigree. She forced it upward. It bit her. The jewel at its center caught a thread of her skin and pulled. She gasped, not from pain, but surprise. She bled. The crimson pearl welled, rolled, and dropped onto her sleeve. It spread into the fabric slowly, like ink writing something only she could read. The mirror, once hidden behind a velvet drape, had been uncovered by an inattentive maid. Mary caught her own reflection by accident and flinched, not because she saw herself, because she didn't recognize what she saw. Her face was not hers. It was a composite, Catherine's sunken eyes, Henry's jowled jaw, Anne Boleyn's half-smile flickering behind the cheekbones. Her hair clung in patches oiled to her scalp. The color had drained from her skin, leaving her the hue of parchment long exposed to damp. The Queen looked like a relic, or a warning. She asked that the mirror be removed entirely, smashed if possible. No one questioned her. The glass was shattered before evening, its fragments swept away like the teeth of a corpse no one wished to name. From her window, she could no longer see the city. The fog was too thick now, clinging to the glass like an omen. But she could still hear it, London heaving and coughing its bells, tolling with a rhythm she now matched. She would wake to their clang, then sleep again, her heart sinking to their slow tolling countdown. The physicians returned, though their faces were pale. One examined her from a distance, afraid to touch. He said something of suppuration of fluid in the lungs. She asked if the body could rot before it dies. He offered no answer. So she answered for him. Yes. I am proof. Some nights she talked aloud to people who weren't there. She didn't believe they would answer, but she needed to confess. The room became her confessional. The flames in the hearth, her priest. I tried, she whispered once, fingers twitching against the blanket. I tried to give them what they wanted. I gave them my blood, my womb, my soul. The fire said nothing, but it swayed as though moved. She didn't dream anymore. Dreams required hope. What replaced them were flashes, burned faces, drifting ash, the cradle filled with something wet and red. Once she saw her mother's body laid out again, but this time the face was her own. She asked her ladies for music, not harps or viols, just a single voice. One woman sang a Marian hymn soft as gauze, her hands trembling as she knelt beside the Queen. Halfway through she faltered. Mary, eyes closed, said, They sang that at the stake. The girl did not return the next day. The nobles grew louder outside her doors. Plans were being made. Elizabeth's name was spoken not as a future, but as inevitability. There was no council anymore, only vultures waiting to see which part of her would cool first. Even the priests grew nervous. One left a relic beside her bed without permission, a tiny splinter said to be from Christ's cross. Mary picked it up and held it to her lip. She whispered, "He died. Clean. I die soaked." No one responded. No one came to anoint her. The once bustling court now moved around her, like ghosts imitating servants. They did their duties with downcast eyes, and the stiffness of actors who know the play's final scene draws near. Even the guards outside her chamber began to rotate less frequently. They were already guarding a tomb. She asked for Philip again. He did not answer. But that night in her fever, she felt a weight beside her in the bed. Heavy. Familiar. She reached out in the dark. Her fingers met something cold, metallic. The crown. It had been placed beside her pillow. She hadn't ordered it. No one had. She tried to push it away, but her hand faltered. It rolled against her shoulder like a loyal hound or a manacle. Its edge scraped her collarbone, reopened the cut it had made earlier. She bled again. Not much, just a drop. But it was enough. She turned to it and whispered, "You've had your fill." The gold didn't glint, it only waited. The end came not with thunder or triumph, but with a stillness so profound, the flame in the hearth hesitated, as though it too awaited permission to flicker. On a morning blurred by fog, thick as wool, the Queen of England lay unmoving in her bed of ghosts. Her chest rose only slightly now, barely enough to disturb the lace on her bodice. Every exhale was a negotiation. Her body, that hollow cathedral of miscarried hopes and unanswered prayers, had collapsed inward, leaving only bone and breath. Outside her chamber, the court waited. Not for recovery, none dared imagine that now, but for the moment her breath would finally fail. It would be announced with ceremony. A priest would intone a psalm. A black flag would be raised over the tower. But inside that chamber time did not behave. The hours folded in on themselves. Moments returned from earlier years like uninvited guests, her coronation. The first child she thought she felt kick, the smell of ash in the folds of her gown, Philip's first kiss and his last silence, the pyres at Smithfield and Oxford, and the screams that came not from strangers, but from herself. She was not alone. They had come. Not the living, never them. The dead gathered quietly at the edges of her vision. She saw their outlines in the folds of the drapes, the pattern in the floorboards, the curve of the ceiling moldings. Jane Grey, still cradling her severed innocence. The Marian martyr's flesh flayed open by holy decree. Anne head tilted at an impossible angle, smiling through scorched lips. Even her mother, still unyielding in death, watched without weeping, and among them, the child, the one who never was. It stood by the cradle, not quite formed, smoke where limbs should be a void behind the eyes. It did not move, but it stared, with judgment, with love, with nothing she could not tell. Her fingers twitched. She turned her head barely and saw the crown still on the pillow beside her. Dried blood ringed its base like a halo gone rotten. It was no longer beautiful. It never had been. Just gilded iron, bent to hold pain. She rasped one final order. "Take it away." No one heard. No one came. Even now they feared her too much to answer her final plea. So she faced it alone. And as her vision narrowed, as her pulse sputtered, something ancient rose inside her. Not sorrow, not rage, not even faith, but truth. This was not martyrdom. It was erasure. She had tried to cauterize a broken nation with flame, to cleanse it with blood, to make herself a vessel, a weapon, a mother to a country that spat her name back in smoke. And in doing so, She had burned herself to the bone. No monument would say that. No anthem would mourn it. History would recite her cruelty, count her corpses, use her name as a warning, not a memory. She knew this, had always known it. That was the bargain. But in her final second, when her eyes fixed beyond the canopy and into the endless blank of dying mind, she whispered not to God, not to England, not even to the unborn child, but to time itself, "Bury me deep, not in earth, but in forgetting." Then silence, not peace, just absence. The bells rang. Outside, the council readied the proclamation. Queen Mary is dead. Elizabeth reigns. Already her name was being rewritten in ink still wet with fear. Already poets sharpened lines about mercy's return. Progress's dawn, the new hope of the Virgin Queen. No room for fire in that verse. No room for ash. The body was prepared, sealed, veiled. Her ladies dressed her with hands that trembled. The crown was not placed upon her. It had cut her too deeply. Instead, they buried it with her locked in a velvet-lined casket beside her cold hands. When the tomb was sealed, they turned away quickly. Even in death, the air around her seemed heavier, as if the walls refused to breathe until she was truly gone. She was laid to rest in Westminster, near her sister, later joined by Elizabeth herself. But in that shared stone womb, only one name would rise. Only one legacy would endure. And Mary, she would be the shadow beside the light, the echo to the anthem, the fire that scorched but did not last. And yet even now, when the fog creeps in from the Thames and the cathedral bells falter in rhythm, some say they see her. A pale woman walking between tombs, carrying nothing, not a child, not a crown, only the weight of being misunderstood. And in her silence we are reminded, history does not forgive. It selects, it shapes, it executes.